Well, hello, everybody, and welcome into Countdown to Kickoff. A little bit of a different spin on Countdown to Kickoff than what you may be used to. I am Conrad Van Order alongside Damian Mitchell. Yes, you may remember us from Morning Jocks. If you are not familiar with Morning Jocks, you can tune in each and every weekday here on Jocks 94.5 and catch Damian and myself as we react to everything that happened the night before, and we are the first voice getting to react to everything that goes on throughout the college football season here on Jocks 94.5. I'm very excited to get to start Countdown to Kickoff. Here we are getting ready for week 2 of the college football season. Week 1, a lot of blowouts, Damian, kind of across the board in the SEC. You had Georgia with a big win over Clemson, but as far as it goes for the Alabamas and Auburns of the world, big wins over inferior competition, just call it how it is. And now we head into week 2 with a step up in competition for both Alabama and Auburn. And we are going to kick off this edition of Countdown to Kickoff with a look at the Alabama Crimson Tide as they host South Florida in a rematch of a game that, if you're an Alabama fan, you certainly remember from last year because you went down to Florida and you had a monsoon essentially down there. You had a weather delay. Jalen Milroe got benched. Tyler Buchner, this time last year, Damian, we are getting ready to talk about an Alabama football team being led out onto the field by Tyler Buchner, who, if I'm not mistaken, is currently a walk-on wide receiver at Notre Dame. It's crazy how much things can change in a year, but now second game with Kalen DeBoer, Jalen Milroe starting this year. He got benched last year. And based on what we saw last week, it looks like Alabama is picking up right where they left off with the retirement of Nick Saban. So diving into Alabama's game against USF, Damian, how different are you expecting this game on Saturday to be from what we saw last year down in Florida?
I'm expecting a night and day difference because, one, like you said, Jalen Milroe is the key factor in all of this. Just imagine if he would have played last season, how we would have had such a different outlook as far as what to expect from Alabama, especially in the offensive side. I mean, it was a struggle amongst the, like you said, the monsoon that started off, the game delay, and the inconsistency that we saw from Tyler Buchner last season, along with Ty Simpson. I know he came in for the cleanup crew, but now adding Jalen Milroe back to this offense and what we saw last season from this Alabama team is going to be completely different. And you saw what happened last week. If you'd have told me that Jalen Milroe was only going to complete 7 passes, one, I'd probably say, okay, they took him out early. Well, they did because they had explosives all over the field. And I think that for this season, it's more of a, okay, I finally get my chance against this team. Because last season, like we said, Jalen Milroe didn't play, and it was itching at the bit. You could tell that, I mean, he wanted to support his teammates and be with his guys, but it's nothing like being on the field. And I think for Jalen Milroe, it's one of those, all right, let me show y'all what I can do. Let me truly show y'all what I can do. And I think Kalen DeBoer, if there was any sort of recipe of what we're going to look like as an offense, they got a heavy dose of it last week.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. I think that this is going to be there's just an interesting dynamic going into this game, right? Because the players that were here last year or were in Tuscaloosa last year, they're going to have a chip on their shoulder, right? You want something to prove. You want to prove that last year's game was an anomaly, the likes of which we haven't really seen since, 2007 under Nick Saban. And so I think you're going to have a very motivated Alabama team opening up the season. Of course, here in week 2, you're getting the dedication of Nick Saban Field at Bryant-Denny Stadium. So it's going to be a very special day all around on Saturday. But I think this is a good kind of a measuring stick, and I'll bring this up when we talk about Auburn and their game against Cal later on in the show. But it's a good way to look back and say, how far have we come in the last 12 months, right? And because we saw this was, I would argue the last 5 minutes of the Alabama USF game last year, that really felt like the turning point kind of for the Alabama team as a whole. Still no Jalen Milroe, but Roydell and that offensive line really carried the day for Alabama in securing that win down in Florida. And then after that, you saw what happened against Ole Miss and then against Texas A&M with Jalen Milroe showing the world, hey, I'm pretty good at throwing the football too. Yep. I'm not just a guy that's going to scramble and make plays with my legs. And so now here we are 12 months later, a lot of new faces for Alabama, but still that core group that's coming back from last year, it feels like they are going to have a chip on their shoulder, and they're going to go out there on Saturday with something to prove, not only to honor Nick Saban, but also based on what we saw last year, improving, hey, we're a lot better than this team was last year.
I agree. And even if you go back to last week and the expectation of what the air raid is, and we know Western Kentucky was going to throw the ball all over the yard, and people were trying to tell us that TJ Finley all of a sudden was going to be this, world beater all of a sudden.
TJ Finley was acting like he was going to be a world beater because he had thrown for 150 yards against Alabama.
And it's absolutely crazy to think about it. And now to see how that defense responded. Keon Sabb, a guy that transferred from Michigan, who we expected big things, ends up having 2 interceptions. And I think that for Alabama, that kind of gave you a little bit more of a boost that, all right, Nick Saban was a defensive guy. He was a DB's coach. But what Kane Womack has implemented on that defensive side of the ball, they're still just as talented as they have been. Now it's just a different scheme. Now you're seeing these guys really play in space. And I think for South Florida, for an offense that we're used to seeing with Alex Golesh, just spreading the field with the receivers and their placement and things, that's going to be interesting to see because Western Kentucky last weekend for the air raid only totaled 145 yards. Now, I do think that South Florida has, some pieces back with, Brown at quarterback returning for another year. He had some success with his legs a few times, and I think that's a little bit of a different animal that you had with Western Kentucky last week with TJ Finley because he was limited as far as his running ability. But I do think, and I agree with you, that this is going to be more of a measuring stick game for, all right, we're stepping up a little bit in competition. Can we consistently have those explosives? If we have to sustain drives, are we good enough and talented enough to, continue to chew the clock? And I think the variety of the offensive side of the ball, because you saw Justice and Jam both in the backfield continue to have a great day. And we had, discussions all offseason long of how are they going to separate touches. And it looked to me that it didn't even matter what run play was called. Somebody in the backfield was going to get the ball, and they both did exceptional things with it. So I think that for Alabama, both offensively and defensively, knowing that the competition has stepped up, do they continue to keep their focus and keep their foot on their opponent's neck when they have them in that position?
Yeah, and you brought up Byron Brown, the quarterback for USF, and what he was able to do last year. And, you look at the box score and you go, okay, he was 14 of 28 for 87 yards, no touchdowns, and an interception. That's not great. But then you look at what he did on the ground, adding 92 yards on the ground, including a 31-yard scramble that he had at one point there for a big play for USF. And that's a guy that's gotten better, right? And that's kind of the thing here is with Alabama, they've certainly improved in some areas from where they were at the start of last season, but this USF team has improved as well. And so how are you going to be able to contain a guy like Byron Brown? Because as you were saying with TJ Finley, that's not something that the defense really had to account for last week in the season opener against WKU. And so now that's definitely going to be a factor. Again, as Brown had 92 yards on the ground last week in USF's season opener against Bethune-Cookman, he had 74 yards and a touchdown on 8 carries, so averaging over 9 yards a carry last week, and then that went with 150 yards through the air. So that's certainly going to be an interesting factor of how they're able to stop a dual-threat quarterback that we haven't seen this defense have to deal with. And I think another key part of this is if we go back to last year's game, South Florida sacked the quarterback 5 times against Alabama. That was something where, again, if you remember this time or a little over a year ago coming into the season, it was, oh, look how big Alabama's offensive line is. They're going to be, in the Joe Moore Award conversation, maybe one of the best we've seen in recent memory. And that just wasn't the case, right? Because they were too big, they were immobile, and South Florida was able to get creative with some of their pass rushes. And quite frankly, they just had some smaller dudes that were able to find gaps and be able to get after the quarterback. And now, if you're Alabama, Caden Proctor dealing with the injury that he sustained in pregame warmups before week 1. He's fighting to get back this week, but it looks like at the best he's going to be limited. For me personally, Damian, I think that's something to monitor with this offensive line. And Pritchett moving over to left tackle, he's also been banged up, so maybe there's even more movement on the offensive line. But as far as Caden Proctor goes, I feel like that's somebody that you don't need in this game, but it's certainly going to be a factor, even though I think you're better off letting him rest and potentially come back for Wisconsin or Georgia in a few weeks.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And I think that for Caden Proctor, and one thing about offensive linemen, you want cohesiveness and having a piece that you've gone with the spring practice, you've gone with through the summer, and then the first couple weeks of fall camp, and then to have an injury that early on, still being able to overcome it against Western Kentucky because of the competition. But I think for South Florida, they're looking at this as like, all right, they're down one lineman, they just adjusted somebody, they moving somebody over, and I think that for Alabama, cohesiveness on the offensive line is going to be key. So what's going to happen when South Florida does a crazy stunt? Are they going to be able enough to pass things off and things like that? So I'm interested to see how big of a piece it's going to play. I do think you'll probably see some signs against South Florida, but nothing to the extreme where they're definitely going to have an issue at left tackle. But again, you never want to see a guy go down, especially not before the first game of the season.
No, and a guy that was going to be an impact starter for you. Let's make no mistake about it. I wanted to ask you real quick one more thing about this Alabama team going into this matchup, and that's at the receiver position, which you know very, very well. Of course, Ryan Williams stole the show, 2 catches, 139 yards for 2 TDs. But I was surprised. Jeremy Bernard only 1 catch for 17 yards. Wasn't a huge factor. Kendrick Law only 1 catch as well, but it went for that touchdown. What are you looking for from the wide receivers, maybe outside of Ryan Williams, because we spent so much time talking about him? But are you expecting Ryan Williams to already be the go-to guy, or do you think they're going to spread the ball around? You're going to see maybe a Jeremy Bernard really step up and be that go-to guy we were expecting him to be, at least early in the season, with his familiarity with Kalen DeBoer in that offense.
I think Ryan Williams is your number one guy for sure, but I do think that the more you start to spread the wealth, and a lot of it, it could be gameplay, it could be game control, it could be just the way some of the plays were coming in, and I think that, one, without a shadow of a doubt, if you're Jalen, all else fails, I can find 2. But I think the development for Jeremy Bernard, somebody that knows this offense, Kobe Print is starting to step up. And I think the Swiss Army knife of it all is Kendrick Law. It just find ways to give him the ball. I think he's just as explosive as Ryan Williams if you just give him a play. But I do think that we'll see a little bit more distribution of the wealth, I guess you'd say, as far as that receiver position is going.
Well, it's going to be a great sight down there in Tuscaloosa again as they are dedicating the field to the great coach Nick Saban. Nick Saban Field at Bryant-Denny Stadium. This game will kick off on 6 o'clock on Saturday afternoon on ESPN as the Alabama Crimson Tide host the South Florida Bulls. Well, that does it for Alabama, but how about Auburn? Things look pretty good in week 1 against Alabama A&M, but we know it's going to be a step up in competition this week. And again, a game for Auburn that they struggled with last year. How far have they come as we look towards their week 2 matchup against Cal in Jordan-Hare? We dive into that matchup next here on Countdown to Kickoff.
Welcome back into the Jocks Countdown to Kickoff. Damian Mitchell alongside my buddy Conrad Van Order. Also Mollywood. Molly Robinson holding it down behind the scenes, making sure this goes extremely well. As you know, you can hear us on Morning Jocks from 6 to 7. Now I guess you could say it's Morning Jocks after dark, or it should be.
Yeah, but we still, got to keep some things in the drafts, unfortunately. Still got the FCC to worry about.
Absolutely. You heard our first segment when we broke down the Alabama Crimson Tide and their matchup with Western Kentucky, and also looking forward to the South Florida game this weekend. Now we flip it over to the Auburn side of things. I had firsthand view to what Peyton Thorne and this Auburn offense, everything that we had seen and heard over the summer, we got a little taste of it in the spring with Cam Coleman, and we understood the hype. But I'm telling you, when I was there, I know it was Alabama A&M. You knock them off 73-3. But the fact that Auburn scored 73 points absolutely blew my mind. And one thing I will say, Peyton Thorne looked comfortable. And he looked confident. He had a couple miscues. Hugh really got onto him a few times. But I will say, for as much as we rag on Peyton Thorne, he looked extremely comfortable. Maybe it is the pieces around him that needs to that make him elevate his game. And when you have, the Freeze Four and Malcolm Simmons, Bryce Kane, Perry Thompson, Cam Coleman, it does make it seem like, okay, maybe it was a little bit of the receiver's fault last season for a lot of his woes. But I think for Auburn, just seeing that in person and seeing it on the field and finally get some reps with these young guys, I thought they played a pretty much flawless game.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And I think 2 things can be true, right? Because you can look at a game like this and say, well, we don't want to take too much away from it. But I think it's also more than fair to say this Auburn team was not doing anything like this last year. And I think that's where a lot of the excitement and optimism should come from if you're an Auburn fan is, okay, yes, it's Alabama and A&M. It's not this isn't a Power 4 opponent. But regardless of who you put on that field against Auburn last year, they did not look anything like this. And it does start at the quarterback spot with Peyton Thorne, who that looked like a different Peyton Thorne. That looked like a different Peyton Thorne, quite frankly, than what I remember him at Michigan State when he had Keon Coleman and Kenneth Walker and a bunch of those future NFL guys around him and had a really, really special season there. This just looked like somebody that has been working his butt off in the offseason and is on the same page with Hugh Freeze. We know Hugh Freeze is calling the plays now. I think that plays a role as well. But you brought it up. I mean, you can't not talk about it with this Auburn team. Those receivers, it makes a world of difference. I mean, when you have guys, we'll get to the freshmen and what everybody wants to talk about, but I just go back to, and it's because we're previewing Cal as well, but you have a guy like Sam Jackson who comes over, the former Cal quarterback, now a receiver. He's what, your fifth, sixth option there?
Right.
And he's going up and making circus catches in the end zone, granted, again, against Alabama A&M, but he was making plays that, quite frankly, I don't know if Auburn's wide receiver one last year was making. And so the fact that you have added that much depth, it goes such a long way. And you just saw the impact that these freshmen had right off the bat. When you look at Malcolm Simmons, Perry Thompson, and Cam Coleman, combined for 235 receiving yards and 4 total touchdowns if you add in the blocked punt that Malcolm Simmons recovered for a touchdown there in that game as well. Just an absolutely remarkable start for them. And you can feel like not only are they on the same page with Peyton Thorne, which is impressive because Cam Coleman came in the spring. We knew he was going to be a guy that was out there early. But Simmons and Thompson are guys that came in late, right? They've only had fall camp and part of the summer to really get acclimated. And so that they were able to build that chemistry so quickly, I think it has to make you optimistic as an Auburn fan that moving forward, that's only going to get better. Oh, and by the way, we brought over a guy from Penn State named Keandre Lambert-Smith. All he did was 3 catches for 80 yards and 2 touchdowns, and then he went and had himself a nice break because
Absolutely.
It's like, all right, that's my business is taken care of here. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of reason, if you're an Auburn fan, again, Alabama A&M, but what you saw, you have not seen from an Auburn team in years, and I think that's something worth being excited about for sure.
Absolutely. And you look even on the defensive side of things, there are a lot of different guys in a lot of different places. You look at Eugene Asante. He's still that focal point as an outside linebacker, and he's not afraid to stick it down in there and play in the box as well. But I will tell you this, after seeing him in person, Kieron Crawford, the transfer from Arkansas State, he looks different. Like his arms are long. He's a big body. Where's number 24? He's coming off the edge. And when you look at the way that he plays, he's a hustler. Like it doesn't matter where the ball is. He is going to find it. And he was on attack mode. And you look at some pieces in the secondary, having Keontae Scott come back. You look at the transfer from Texas and Thompson, and they seem more experienced in the back end of it. And again, there's only so much you can really take from Alabama A&M, but I do think they're going to get a little bit more of a test with Cal. I think Jay Knott, who we saw last season, he's kind of he's very similar to Kendrick Law. He's a Swiss Army knife out of the backfield. He may not be, the biggest of backs, but what he's able to do in between the tackles, he runs hard, he runs low to the ground. I think for that Auburn defense, you're definitely going to get a bigger test. I do think that you are still in a great position now with DJ Durkin. You can just tell from the depth perspective that this Auburn team gets it. And I think that's what made it so, interesting to see in week 1 was, okay, they're playing fast. Like, they don't even like they're thinking. They're just reacting and having a good time playing defensive side of the ball. And I think that's what's going to carry over against this Cal team because they know it's going to be a little bit more of a step up. And, I mean, you look at Cal even last week against UC Davis, they had some issues. It wasn't the cleanest of first games. They went 2 for 13 on third down. That's the money down. And it's going to be tough to find a way to beat Auburn with percentages like that. And I think that for Auburn to continue to get better, and is how deep that they are, they have a lot of guys they rotate in and out. And I think the more fresh bodies you have within the front 7 that show that they can continue to play, DJ Durkin's going to be extremely comfortable with the defense side of the ball.
Yeah, and I think you're going to see more of an aggressive Auburn defense. And like you said, there's a number of names, that they've done a really, really good job of building up that depth on the defensive side. And that's without, maybe the guy that was getting the ravest reviews coming into the season. He was out last week, and that's Isaiah Rakes, the guy that came over from Texas A&M that transferred into Auburn. And we've heard nothing but very, very good things about him. So this is a defensive front that looks like it's only going to get better for Auburn, especially because you got a lot of young guys that are getting experience, right? Like Malik Blockton had a sack last week against Alabama A&M. Amaris Williams is another young guy that we've heard a lot about in fall camp, and getting these guys reps in these kinds of games is only going to help once you enter SEC play, because you're going to have guys that they're freshmen, but they're not going to have the experience of freshmen, right? Because they're going to have gotten to get a good number of reps and some experience in these first 3 or 4 games for the Auburn Tigers. But I think defensively, again, you brought him up. You got to stop Jaden Ott, right? Because this is a guy that you brought it up. Didn't look great last week against UC Davis. 14 carries, 49 yards, but he did have 2 touchdowns. But he also had 4 catches for 34 yards out of the backfield. And so if you're able to neutralize him as a threat, I feel like this game is pretty much over for Cal, especially having to come on the road. Well, let's be honest. Cal fans are not traveling like Auburn fans did last year. That is just simply not something that's going to happen. But similar to what we were just talking about a few minutes ago with Alabama USF, this is a very good opportunity for Auburn to be able to go and look at how much better have we gotten over the last 12 months. And this is it's Cal. You can say what you want. It's a Power 4 team, right? This is a legitimate opponent that you're going up against. And if you're able to go and have I don't think they're putting up 70 against Cal, but if you're able to go in there and win by, 3 scores, something like that, I think you're going to have this Auburn fan base even more excited as you move forward and get ready for the Arkansas and Oklahomas and some of those bigger tests that await you early on in the schedule. But I think this is going to be a fascinating game for Auburn, and I expect it to look drastically different than what we saw out in California last year.
Absolutely. That game will be at 2:30. A little bit of a time zone difference for Cal.
A little bit.
Yeah, it's gonna be interesting to see how their bodies get adjusted to one. I guess you'd say the speed and the heat of the South. So we're surely looking forward to that game between Auburn and Cal coming up on Saturday. When we return here on the Countdown to Kickoff, we'll take a look at some more teams around the SEC. Keep it locked right here for the Countdown to Kickoff on Jocks 94.5.
Welcome back into Countdown to Kickoff here on Jocks 94.5. Appreciate you joining myself, Conrad Van Order, alongside Damian Mitchell as we get you ready for week 2 of the college football season. If you haven't already checked it out before, though, we highly recommend you listen to us weekdays here on Jocks 94.5. You can catch us on Morning Jocks from 6 to 7 a.m. Monday through Friday as we react to everything that happened the night before and get you set for the day's college football news. And we've already spent some time breaking down Alabama's Week 2 matchup against USF, Auburn's Week 2 matchup against Cal. But now we got to get to what I would say is the biggest game on the slate and one of the biggest games of the entire season, just in terms of brands, how many people are going to be watching, how anticipated this game has been throughout the offseason. And of course, that means that we have to head up to Ann Arbor, Michigan, where the defending national champion, I cannot wait until I don't have to say that anymore, the defending national champion Michigan Wolverines will host the Texas Longhorns, now a member of the SEC. And Damian, this is a game that, while it doesn't have any implications from a conference standpoint, this isn't going to affect either Texas's ability to play in Atlanta or Michigan's ability to go and play in Indianapolis for the Big Ten championship. But this is going to be a huge resume booster for whichever one of these teams gets a win and is ultimately able to have that on their resume come college football playoff selection time. So going into this matchup, you have a Texas team that went and took care of Colorado State 52-0 in week 0, adding on to those SEC blowouts that we saw across the majority of the conference. Michigan, on the other hand, playing Kalen DeBoer's old team, actually, Fresno State, and only won that 30-10. Didn't have probably not the, season opening experience that the Michigan fans were hoping for coming off of a national championship. But now people are going to forget all about that, Damian, if you're able to knock off the top 3 ranked Texas Longhorns in Ann Arbor. So going into this game, how do you view this matchup do you think this is a pretty equal matchup between Texas and Michigan, or based on what we saw in week 1, are you already maybe leaning towards Texas over Michigan? Because let's be honest, Michigan struggled against Fresno State.
Exactly, and struggling is kind of an easy way to put it. I mean, it didn't feel like there was much of a separation in talent between Michigan and Fresno State last week. It feels like there's going to be a bigger gap between Michigan and Texas on Saturday. And I think for Texas, the way they came out and executed, and we, again, a lot of this is prefaced off of the quality of competition. I wasn't expecting Colorado State to kind of come in and pull off an upset or even make it really much of a challenge. But what we saw from Quinn Ewers, even what we saw from Arch Manning and those guys, I know your favorite receiver from the University of Alabama, he made his Texas debut, and Isaiah Bond.
Had himself a nice touchdown. Yep.
He did. He
Good
did
for him.
indeed. But I think right now, especially from what I saw last week, it's very difficult for me to feel optimistic about what Michigan has in front of them this weekend, because it took you literally the fourth quarter. If the fourth quarter didn't happen, Fresno State had you beat. They had you beat multiple times throughout that game, and it wasn't the cleanest of games for Fresno State. And I think for Texas right now is to avoid the press clippings. Don't listen to the rat poison, as Nick Saban would say. Mm-hmm. But you are going in the better team by far. And I think what they saw last week in Michigan, it's very hard for me to sit here and try to, put lipstick on the pig and think that Michigan all of a sudden this week is going to turn up. Or, maybe they did use last week as kind of getting caught sleepwalking a little bit or kind of looking ahead of what you have to for Texas. But I think for Donovan Edwards, a guy that graced the cover of NCAA football game, he didn't have the performance that we were looking for or expecting from him. So there's a lot of tall tasks that Michigan has to overcome, and I don't believe that it's going to happen against the Texas Longhorns.
That's what my gut is telling me too right now, Damian, because you look at this Michigan team, and going into last season, you knew, all right, they're going to have a good defense. They got a two-headed monster, as we thought, at running back. But the questions, I feel like a lot of them came down to J.J. McCarthy and how much growth could he have. And while they still didn't ask him to do a ton, there's a reason that this guy was a first-round pick in the NFL draft. Regardless of what you may think of him, the guy had some talent, and he was the best quarterback that Michigan has had in a significant number of years, probably going back to Denard Robinson about a decade ago. And now he's out, and everyone thinks, okay, it's going to be Alex Orji. We got to see him a little bit in the college football playoff, having a little bit of a different look to the Michigan offense. No, it's a walk-on. Davis Warren is named the starting quarterback for Michigan, and this was not something that was, maybe if you were in the loop there in Ann Arbor, you were aware of this, but this was something that was made aware to, I think, most college football fans, 24 hours or so before the game started. So it seemed like it was kind of a last-minute decision. He goes out there against Fresno State, 15-25 for 118 yards, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. And you bring up Donovan Edwards, 11 carries, but only 27 yards.
That ain't going to get it done.
It's not. The good news is you had Khalil Mullings, who went for 15 carries for 92 yards. So you have something there that's working for you in the running back room, but it's not Donovan Edwards, at least not in week 1. And I just think that's a lot that you're going up. That's a lot of pressure you're going to be putting on your defense to be able to withhold this Texas offense, because I could see this game looking similar, to what we saw with Georgia and Clemson, right? Where for the first half, it was close. Clemson held their own defensively while they were waiting for their offense to hit a rhythm. Ultimately, that never happened for them. And you saw the defense kind of fell apart, because it's, all right, the offense isn't giving us anything. We've held on as long as we can. We're gassed. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if we're going to see something similar where, since it is in Ann Arbor, Michigan's going to be fired up. The crowd's going to be rocking. They still have a very, very good defense. I could see them making it interesting early on and being a struggle for Texas. But I feel like ultimately the weapons that Texas has, the quarterback, Quinn Ewers, is significantly better than what Michigan's going to roll out there. I just think that, it's going to be too much for Michigan to handle, especially in the second half. And the depth that Texas has built up at a number of key positions, I think, is something that gives you optimism about them coming into the SEC. But in this game, and you just look at what they did coming down to Bryant-Denny last year, getting that big win over Alabama. If they hadn't been able to do that, I might not be as confident about them going up to the big house. But seeing what they did in Bryant-Denny last year, I think this team is ready to go up to Michigan and put up a good fight.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And when I look at this Texas unit, and when I look at Michigan's defensive side of the ball too, I don't know how they can stay in front of these receivers that Texas has. And I understand Fresno State only had 9 yards of rushing, but to me, I know that Texas have had some injuries, leading into fall camp. They still were able to run the ball against Colorado State. They weren't afraid to still dial up some runs with Jaden Blue and those guys in the backfield. And for Michigan, if you're asking your secondary to stop a guy that's been playing college football for Lord knows how long now with Quinn Ewers, he's seen a lot of defenses. And I don't think you have the pieces right now to make this a slugfest. You're going to have to put up points offensively. And from what I saw against Fresno State, I find it very, very difficult to believe that's going to light up against Texas.
And I think going into it, we would say that, if you had to pick a defense, I think we would both take Michigan's over Texas. But again, Texas shut out Colorado State, and I know it's Colorado State, but it's not easy to shut people out, especially in today's world of college football and how much of an emphasis is put on offense. This is a Texas defense that, as a lot of people learned last year, but if you've forgotten, they're no slouch either. And so while you may give Michigan that advantage there, I think the gap on the offensive side of the ball is significant between these two opponents. Even though I know it's a home game for Michigan, you have something to prove now, after struggling a little bit in that season opener against Fresno State. But I think Texas is ready for this challenge, and I think that this is going to be a bit of a springboard for Texas as they get ready for their first season here in the SEC. And we're going to see why a lot of people had them projected to be in Atlanta and be in the college football playoff at the end of this regular season.
I agree with you 100%. And Texas, to me, you're the better team. Don't overthink it. Play within your system. Play like you're supposed to. I think you handle your business with Michigan rather quickly.
Yeah, I would be surprised if that is ultimately not the outcome this Saturday. And the good news with this game is if you like waking up early, you're going to get this one at 11 a.m. So this one is going to be on Fox. It'll be there after Big Noon Kickoff, both College Game Day and Big Noon Kickoff. Double dipping in Ann Arbor this weekend. So that will be a great way to start off week 2 of college football on Saturday morning. All right, when we return here on Countdown to Kickoff, we got some other big games going on in the SEC. Tennessee looking to be challenged against another ranked opponent. And could Arkansas pull off one of maybe the biggest upset of the early part of the 2024 season? We will dive into those and the rest of week 2 around the SEC when we return here on Countdown to Kickoff.
Welcome back into the Countdown to Kickoff here for Jocks. Damian Mitchell, Conrad Van Order, Molly Robinson holding things down behind the glass. As we take a dive into the SEC, first couple segments, we got a chance to talk about Alabama and their matchup with South Florida, Auburn taking on Cal. And now we get to talk about, we had Texas and Michigan in that matchup. Now we're bringing it back down here.
Yeah, from one shade of orange to another, right, Damian?
Yes, sir. Ski taking that trip to Charlotte, North Carolina in the Dukes Mayo Classic. Tennessee taking on the NC State Wolfpack. Both teams had some highs, had some lows in week 1, especially for NC State. Grayson McCall transfers from Coastal Carolina, one of the more efficient quarterbacks in college football over these past 3-4 years. Now he looks like he's got some adjustments to do at NC State. When you flip it over to Tennessee and open up with Chattanooga, we had a feeling that Nico was going to be pretty good. And if you watch that game,
he's pretty good.
He is pretty damn good. Mm-hmm. There's no way around it. But I think for both offenses, especially for Tennessee, it's kind of the theme of week 2. You're stepping up a little bit in competition. 2 ranked teams, both looking to contend in their respective conferences. But I think for Tennessee, what you saw from Nico was what Tennessee wanted from Joe Milton last year, being able to efficiently run the offense. It looked like Nico has been in this thing for a couple seasons. Like, he looks extremely comfortable. He's very accurate. If he needed to step around in the pocket, he did a great job at that. You add Dylan Sampson out of that backfield. He's pretty much picking up where he left off last season. And that receiving core, we have been on pretty much just an alert for Dante Thornton for the past 2 seasons. And he had a hell of a ball game. He had a hell of a ball game in that Josh Heupel system. And the return for Brew McCoy, a guy that has had some mountains to climb as far as dealing with injury, transferring from USC and just finding his way in this offense. You can tell that he looks healthy, he looks confident. And to me, Tennessee on both sides of the ball, this is probably about the close of a perfect game that you could possibly get. And now looking forward to NC State, a team that's probably having a little bit of a soul search a little bit in their locker room after their win over Western Carolina. That wasn't as easy as we thought it was going to be. But I think collectively, this is probably going to be one of the better games we have on Saturday. And, I call myself the Heupel disciple. And if this offense continues to look like the way it does, Tennessee is going to set themselves up for a nice road in 2024.
Yeah, I think we're going to learn a lot about Tennessee. And I feel pretty good about what I saw against Chattanooga in the sense that, as we've talked about with all these games, you're not playing the toughest competition, but there are guys that you just watch throw a football or you just watch them on a field and you go, they have an it factor. They have something that 99.9% of other guys don't have. And Nico has that. I was so impressed with his command of the offense. Because like you said, it looked like a guy that was going into his third year as a starter somewhere. And it was his second career start after his first one was in the bowl game against Iowa last year. And I think an interesting part is, maybe we have to see this because it's NC State. It's a step up. It's a ranked opponent. But we didn't see Nico have to really use his legs, right? He had 4 runs for 6 yards. So he wasn't really doing much with that. It was just, when necessary, taking the ball and trying to get back to the line of scrimmage. But we go back to that bowl game against Iowa, and he had, over 15 carries, I think, in that game. And it was, man, what is the run-pass balance going to be for Nico? And that was just something we didn't have to see against Chattanooga. But how much of a factor does that potentially play? Because when you pile that on with what you got from Dylan Sampson last week, 12 carries, 124 yards, 3 touchdowns to go with 3 receptions for 29 yards. I mean, that would be a very, very potent attack on the ground for Tennessee, which would be kind of like what we saw last year, right? Because you had to make up for some of the deficiencies of Joe Milton. But I think this is a big game for Nico, and if he goes out there and looks like he did against Chattanooga, this is going to be a guy that is very quickly rising up those Heisman rankings, I think, and we're going to learn a lot about both of these teams. But I think Tennessee going into this one, they have a lot of momentum behind them going up against an NC State team that was losing. They were losing to Western Carolina going into the fourth quarter last week. Then they scored 21 unanswered to get the 38-21 win. But this is going to be a big challenge for Grayson McCall and the Wolfpack for sure.
Absolutely. But that's also not the only game in the SEC across from the Big 12 as well. When we look at this Arkansas versus Oklahoma State matchup, even on paper, going into the season, Mike Gundy, he's got some blow it in him. He's had a few games where you're just scratching your head. Now you're welcoming in an SEC opponent in Arkansas who, granted, Arkansas Pine Bluff,
they're really bad.
They're not good.
They're
They're
bad.
just not a good football team. And Arkansas went out there and mopped the floor with them.
Yes.
But if you're an Arkansas Razorback fan, you have to feel extremely confident in what you saw with the operation of Taylon Green, a guy that transferred in from Boise State. And we were looking at what this identity of the Hogs were going to be. They still made it a point to run the football, but their efficiency in the pass game, granted again, is Arkansas Pine Bluff. If they can get that Taylon Green to show up on Saturday, it's going to be a ball game in Oklahoma, because Oklahoma State, to me, yes, you play South Dakota State, but it didn't feel like you dominated that football game. And to have the veteran presence of an Alec Bowman at quarterback and also Ollie Gordon, who led the nation in rushing last season, I think collectively that you have to make sure your chin strap is buckled when you play this Arkansas Razorback team on Saturday.
Yeah, I think we're going to see a better Oklahoma State team on Saturday, no doubt about it, because, South Dakota, you won by 24, but it was 17-6 at halftime. You had that big third quarter. And things, just like you were saying, they didn't run as smoothly as you would hope for a season opener against an FCS opponent. But Ollie Gordon, 28 carries, 126 yards, 3 tutties, just an absolute monster. And we knew that coming in, that he was going to be one of, if not the best running backs in college football yet again this season. A lot of experience at the quarterback position with a guy coming into his 7th season. Make all the jokes you will, but a guy that's seen a lot of college football there in Alan Bowman. But this game for me is about Arkansas. And you're going on the road with an opportunity to reset expectations. I will say that, because I think if you were able to win this game on the road, not only would it be an upset, but I think you start looking at some of the games on their schedule, namely that Auburn matchup that's coming up in a couple of weeks, and you start to really view this Arkansas team with a different lens. And a lot of that has to do with what we saw from Taylon Green last week. Some of the scrambles that he made, those aren't happening against Power 4 teams. Let's be honest. They're just not. He's an elusive guy. No one's that elusive, right? And so how does he, with the step up in competition, how does he perform in this game, going on the road, going up against a Big 12 team? And it's it's going to be a tall task for them to replicate what they did offensively last week. I mean, there's not many teams ever that have scored 10 straight touchdowns on every single possession of the game. But I think with Bobby Petrino, they're calling the plays. They seem to be pretty comfortable with what they're going to want to do. They had 14 different receivers that caught a pass last week. So while you may not have one guy that's going to step up and dominate, they have so many options, so many ways to spread it out and keep guys that are fresh out on the field that can go and make plays. but they were really good running the football. Taylor Green, 88 yards and 2 touchdowns at the quarterback spot. Jaquindon Jackson, over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns on only 8 carries. This is a very dangerous Arkansas offense based on what we saw against Arkansas Pine Bluff. And now it's just how does that translate going up against a ranked team on the road? Because, again, if you're Arkansas, I think they're going to keep this close. I don't know if I'm ready to call for the outright upset, but I think they are going to keep this a one-score game and make it very, very difficult for Oklahoma State. But I don't know if there's a team that necessarily has more to gain with a win this week in terms of how the entire country is going to perceive them moving forward than Arkansas if they're able to go up and knock off Oklahoma State.
Yeah, I agree. And I think for Oklahoma State, you have to be ready for the fist fight.
Yes.
It's coming, and there's no way around it. And when you look at Mike Gundy and his track record, there are so many questionable losses on his resume.
There are.
It's, what were you thinking? What were you doing as far as just getting your team ready to play these types of matchups? And I think for Arkansas, they're looking at it as, we're playing with house money. People don't even expect us to be contending for anything. But like you said, how different does it look for this Arkansas unit if they find a way to beat Oklahoma State on the road on top of that? Because to me, Sam Pittman he's a lovable coach. You can see why those guys play for him. And I think that now, as we're getting into this new age of football and this new era in 2024, you don't have many guys that are just loyal to a coach. It's one of those, I would love to play for Sam Pittman. And I think that once you see how this unit, and adding Bobby Petrino as the offensive coordinator, somebody that's been at Arkansas for a long time, he knows how to win there. To me, it sets up for a great recipe for Arkansas. I'm agree with you. I'm not going to say they're going to pull off the upset. One, I wouldn't be surprised if it happens, but two, they can make this a really tough ball game for Oklahoma State.
Absolutely. Well, that does it for the first edition of Countdown to Kickoff with myself, Conrad Van Order, and Damian Mitchell, running through what you can expect in week 2 of the college football season. Again, you have Alabama taking on South Florida, Auburn taking on Cal, the big game between Texas and Michigan. We got Arkansas, Oklahoma State, Tennessee taking on NC State, and then you even have an all-SEC matchup this early on, actually, with South Carolina and Kentucky. Maybe not the two most attractive teams in the SEC that could be playing this early, but again, it's an all-SEC game. That's certainly one that's going to have big implications on the rest of the season. So we'll be back next week, but this is us signing off here on Countdown to Kickoff. Enjoy your college football weekend, week 2 of the college football season. It's